This is Bill Tinglin with Tour for Tolerance, proud sponsor of this podcast series on the Holocaust. Get ready. This week we take another powerful deep dive into history's darkest hour.
Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. This time we're going to get into an incredible story, one that really, I think, embodies just incredible resilience and defiance. The story of the Vilna Ghetto Uprising.
Absolutely, and I think one that forces us to really reckon with I guess maybe some assumptions we might have about what people are capable of under such extreme pressure. We're talking about a systematic attempt to erase an entire people.
Yeah.
And yet within this, you see the emergence of this really powerful resistance movement.
Yeah, and we talk about the Holocaust a lot on the show, and I think what makes the Vilna Ghetto Uprising so unique is that it's not just about survival, it's about actively fighting back against the Nazis and refusing to be passive victims.
Yeah, and I think it's a story that asks us to consider, what would we do in the face of such unimaginable evil?
Yeah.
And how can hope flicker even in the darkest of times?
Let's set the stage a little bit for our listener. We're talking about the Vilna Ghetto in Lithuania. Tens of thousands of Jewish people crammed into a tiny area. Can you maybe paint a picture of the conditions they were forced to endure?
Yeah, imagine being confined to a small, overcrowded space with very inadequate food, sanitation, medical care. Disease was rampant. The constant fear of deportation to concentration camps hung over everyone.
And it wasn't just the threat of the camps, right? Right outside the city in the Ponary forest, the Nazis were systematically murdering tens of thousands of Jews. That had to just create this level of psychological terror that's hard for us to even grasp.
Absolutely. And, it was a calculated strategy of terror designed to break their spirit.
Yeah.
But amidst this suffering, amidst this fear, the seeds of resistance were being sown. In January of 1942, a group of individuals came together to form the United Partisan Organization, or FPO,
right?
The first underground resistance group in any Jewish ghetto, Nazi-occupied Europe.
This wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment decision, was it? To even think about organizing a resistance movement within a ghetto under the watchful eyes of the Nazis.
It certainly took immense courage and a belief that they could make a difference, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds.
Yeah.
The leaders of the FPO, individuals like Yitzhak Wittenberg, Abba Kovner, Joseph Glasman, and Ruska Korczak-Marla, they recognized that simply surviving wasn't enough.
Right.
They wanted to fight back to resist the dehumanization that the Nazis were inflicting upon them.
And their goal wasn't just to cause a little trouble for the Nazis either. They were actually preparing for armed combat, hoping to eventually join forces with partisan groups operating in the forests outside the ghetto. Now, when we say partisan, we're talking about groups engaging in guerrilla warfare, right? Sabotage, ambushes, hit-and-run tactics.
Exactly. The FPO saw themselves as part of a larger struggle against Nazi tyranny. They understood that their actions, however small they might seem, could contribute to the broader war effort.
Right.
They were fighting for their own freedom. Yes, but also for the freedom of others, for a future where such atrocities would never be repeated.
It's just amazing to think about these individuals living under such horrific conditions, yet finding the strength and the will to not only resist, but to plan for a future beyond the ghetto walls. But of course, the reality of their situation was that the Nazis were closing in, determined to liquidate the ghetto and send the remaining inhabitants to the death camps.
This situation became increasingly dire. By September 1st, 1943, the Nazis began the final liquidation of the Vilna Ghetto,
Right.
meaning they were rounding up everyone who remained, intending to deport them to the camps.
So the FPO leaders are faced with this impossible choice, right? Surrender to certain death, or fight back knowing that they're heavily outmatched. What do you think went through their minds as they weighed these options? Did they even believe they had a chance?
I think it was a moment of truth, a real test of their commitment to resistance.
Yeah.
And in that moment, the FPO leaders made a decision that would forever etch their names in history. They chose to fight back.
Knowing they were facing the full might of the German army, armed with, little more than pistols, grenades, a few rifles, it must seem like a suicide mission.
Yeah.
So what do you think gave them the courage to make that choice? What were they hoping to achieve?
I think their courage stemmed from this deep sense of purpose, a refusal to let the Nazis dictate the terms of their demise. They knew they couldn't defeat the Germans outright, but they could make them pay a price for their brutality. They could show the world that even in the face of this, overwhelming force, that the human spirit could not be extinguished.
And they weren't just fighting for themselves, right? They were fighting for their families, their community, for the very idea that even in the darkest of times, hope can exist.
That's absolutely. Their resistance was an act of defiance, a declaration that they would not be dehumanized, that they would not go quietly into the night.
Right.
And their choice inspired others. I mean, imagine seeing your neighbors, your friends, taking up arms against these oppressors, refusing to surrender.
Yeah, it must have been electrifying, this moment of, I guess, collective empowerment in the face of despair. So how did this David and Goliath battle actually unfold? What strategies did the FPO employ to even stand a chance against the Nazis?
Well, they used their knowledge of the ghetto to their advantage. They turned the narrow streets and the cramped buildings into a battleground. They staged ambushes, they laid traps, they exploited every opportunity to disrupt the Nazi advance.
Wow.
They knew they couldn't win in a conventional fight, so they fought a guerrilla war, relying on surprise and mobility to keep the Germans off balance.
And amidst this chaos and violence, were there individual acts of heroism that stand out? You mentioned Yitzhak Wittenberg earlier. His story, I think, is particularly poignant.
Wittenberg was a true leader.
Mhm.
He was a man who inspired those around him with his courage and determination. At one point, he was captured by the Nazis, but his comrades risked their lives to rescue him. Later, when the Germans threatened to unleash brutal reprisals against the entire ghetto, if Wittenberg didn't surrender, he made the ultimate sacrifice. He turned himself in to save the lives of others.
It's hard to fathom that level of selflessness, to put the well-being of others above your own survival.
Yeah.
Knowing that you're walking into certain death, it's really a testament to the power of the human spirit to rise above even the most horrific circumstances. But the story of the Vilna Ghetto Resistance isn't just about military tactics and acts of heroism. It's also about the power of culture and art to sustain hope and fuel defiance. You mentioned Abba Kovner, the poet who became a resistance leader. What role did his poetry play in the ghetto?
Kovner's poetry was a weapon. It was a source of inspiration and strength for the people of the ghetto. His words gave voice to their pain, their anger, and their determination to resist.
Right.
He wrote about the horrors they were enduring, but also about the importance of holding on to their humanity, their identity, their hope for a better future.
So even in the midst of unimaginable suffering, they were finding ways to express themselves, to create beauty and meaning. It's like they were refusing to let the Nazis steal their souls, their very essence as human beings. Do you have an example of Kovner's poetry that you could share that might give our listeners a sense of its power?
In one of his most famous poems, written shortly after the Nazis invaded Lithuania, Kovner urges his fellow Jews to resist. He says, "Let us not go like sheep to the slaughter."
Wow.
His words became a rallying cry, a call to action. That resonated deeply within the ghetto.
It's incredible to think that poetry, something we often associate with beauty and introspection, could become such a potent force for resistance in such a brutal environment. It speaks to the power of words to move people, to inspire them to action even in the face of despair. And it wasn't just poetry. The Vilna Ghetto even had a theater, right?
Yes.
Tell us about that.
The ghetto theater was another remarkable example of cultural resistance. Imagine actors rehearsing and performing plays while living under this constant threat of death. The theater became a space where they could momentarily escape the horrors of their reality, where they could connect with each other, and where they could affirm their humanity through art.
It must have provided them with at least some sense of normalcy, a reminder of the life that had been stolen from them. It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the ability to find beauty and meaning even in the darkest of times.
Precisely. It's a reminder that resistance can take many forms, that it's not always about, these physical confrontations. Sometimes the most powerful acts of resistance are those that affirm our humanity, our creativity, our connection to something larger than ourselves.
So while the Vilna Ghetto uprising was ultimately unsuccessful in preventing the liquidation of the ghetto, it did something perhaps even more significant. It showed the world that even in the face of unimaginable evil, people can choose to resist, to fight back, to die on their own terms.
And for those who did manage to escape the ghetto, their fight didn't end there. They joined the partisan movement in the surrounding forests, continuing their resistance against the Nazis.
Tell us about that next chapter in their story. What was it like for these former ghetto residents, many of whom had never held a weapon before, to suddenly find themselves living and fighting in the dense forests of Lithuania?
I mean, it must have been a jarring transition, right? Going from the confines of the ghetto to the vastness of the forest.
Yeah. What kind of challenges did they face as partisan fighters?
Well, I imagine, the shift from the crowded ghetto to the dense forests was a shock to many. But for many, it was also liberating. They were no longer surrounded by barbed wire and Nazi guards. They could breathe fresh air, move freely, and connect with nature.
Right.
But of course, life as a forest partisan was incredibly difficult. They were constantly on the move, hiding from the enemy, scrounging for food and supplies. The winters were harsh, and the threat of being captured or killed was ever present.
Yeah, I can only imagine the resilience it took to survive in those conditions, to continue fighting despite the hardships.
Hmm.
What were their goals as partisan fighters at this point? Were they still hoping to liberate the ghetto?
I think by then the goal had shifted from, outright liberation of the ghetto to something more focused. They knew the ghetto was lost, but they could still strike blows against the Nazi war machine.
Okay.
Their objective was to disrupt the enemy's operations, to sabotage their supply lines, and to inflict casualties whenever possible.
Wow.
Every act of resistance, no matter how small, was a victory in their eyes.
So they were no longer fighting for their own survival within the ghetto walls, but for a larger cause, for the defeat of Nazism and the liberation of all those who were suffering under its tyranny.
Exactly. And their efforts had a real impact on the war. These partisan fighters tied down German troops, they disrupted their communications, and they slowed their advance.
Wow.
They were a constant thorn in the side of the Nazi war machine, contributing to the Allied victory in ways that might not have been fully appreciated at the time.
So their story is a powerful reminder that resistance can take many forms, and that even those who seem powerless can find ways to fight back against oppression. We've talked about the physical and cultural resistance within the ghetto, the daring uprising, the continued struggle in the forests. What does it all mean? Why should this story matter to us today, decades later?
Well, there's a story that speaks to the resilience of the human spirit, to our capacity for courage and hope, even in the face of this unimaginable evil. It's a reminder that we all have a choice. Even when it seems like all choices have been taken from us, we can choose to be passive bystanders, or we can choose to resist, to fight for what we believe in no matter the cost.
And their story isn't just about the past, right? I mean, it's a message that resonates, I think, deeply in our own time. A time when we see rising authoritarianism, intolerance, and attempts to silence dissenting voices. The Vilna Ghetto Uprising reminds us that we must never take our freedoms for granted, and that we have a responsibility to speak out against injustice wherever we see it.
Exactly. It's a call to action, an invitation to consider what we would do in similar circumstances. Would we have the courage to resist? Would we find ways to hold on to our humanity, our creativity, our hope, even in the darkest of times?
It's a challenge to look inward and to find the strength within ourselves to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult, even when it's dangerous.
And it's a reminder that every act of resistance, no matter how small, can make a difference. The FPO, they chose to fight back knowing they were likely to die. Their choice was an affirmation of life, a refusal to let evil triumph.
Yeah, it's a legacy of defiance that continues to inspire us today. Their story teaches us that hope can exist even in the darkest of times, and that hope can fuel these incredible acts of courage, resilience, and resistance.
So as we conclude this deep dive into the Vilna Ghetto Uprising, I encourage you to learn more about this story, to reflect on its lessons, and to find ways to carry its message of hope and resilience forward in your own life. The Vilna Ghetto Uprising wasn't just a historical event. It's a timeless message about the power of the human spirit to resist even the most brutal forms of oppression.
It's a story that challenges us, inspires us, and reminds us of the importance of fighting for what's right, no matter the cost.